I've talked to a lot of people lately, but this is one of my favorite guests I can think coming up. I can tell already. She's Sarah Russell. She's a 17-year-old high school junior in Indiana, and I love this girl's spunk. She is willing to actually say things and speak out for her conservative values in ways that conservative professors and conservative college students will not. They're cowering in their dorm rooms and their faculty lounges, and we've got Sarah here today. Sarah, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, your story is such a rich one. There's so many things you've experienced. Start by telling us a little bit. What's it like to be a conservative, a vocal conservative high school junior in a pretty red state, Indiana, in spite of that? What's it like a day-to-day for you as a conservative kid?
Well, it's kind of lonely. I lost friends, and I am kind of a social outcast at this point. But, I've been able to find people who actually care about me, so that's been one good thing that's come of this.
Well, we know, right, to be committed to the truth, to be true to yourself, these are isolating things, unfortunately, in our culture. Let me guess, how many of these people that have rejected you, how many of these people that have frozen you out on your school campus, how many of them have ever bothered to approach you to help try to understand what you think about issues? Do you get that, or is it more they find out you're conservative and that's the end of it?
Well, it goes, both of those things happen. Sometimes people will come to me just to pick a fight, and then they decide they don't like me. And some of them just will hear stuff from other people at school, and then they just assume that they don't like me.
Well, you have had some interesting experiences. Talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about your speech class. This was an interesting story. Tell us a little bit what happened to you in your high school speech classroom.
Yeah, thankfully I'm not in that class this semester. Our textbook was very interesting. One of the very interesting pages was an entire page devoted to different gender pronouns. Like, there was actually a box that had a list of gender pronouns, and it gave a bunch of different definitions of gender versus, biological sex. And then it gave some advice to teachers about how to deal with transgender students.
And what did any of that have to do with an actual course in speech?
Well, they have to police your speech, of course.
So, all right. So, in other words, they're using speech class, and one of the points we've made time and time again with all of this revolution in education, Common Core, politicizing of education, is that was going to happen. In every class, whether it's English, history, social studies, speech, gym, there's going to be an excuse why you have to teach kids about sex, about gender, about homosexuality, about transgenderism, about global warming, and they can squeeze it in pretty much anywhere. How did you respond to this assignment? Did you engage your teacher or your classmates about it?
I've engaged classmates in the past about this kind of subject, but I had already engaged this teacher about the wage gap earlier that year, and then he stopped liking me, so I figured that I might not get involved in this one. So
again, speech class, and you're talking about the made-up feminist argument about wage gaps. How did that come up in a speech class?
He decided that it would be beneficial to bring it up like 4 times in one lecture that I think was about history of communication. So I'm not sure what that had to do with anything.
Right. And I remember from my college days, this is a long time, before you were born, I'm sad to say. I remember from my college days taking a mandatory speech class, and the professor made all the speeches about very, very radically liberal issues like a wage gap. And if you were a student who got up and used facts and reason and economics to argue that in reality there really wasn't a wage gap, your grade was docked and lowered. And if you didn't have much on your side other than emotion and feminism, and you argued in favor of the reality of a wage gap, you got you got better grades. Is anything like that happen to you as well?
Well, last year in English, second semester, I had engaged in a conversation when we were doing a practice standardized test, and somehow halfway through the standardized test, it came up because the prompt that we were doing was extremely biased. And so I just kind of snickered at the beginning and then moved on. And then about halfway through, somebody decided to engage me about it. And then I ended up with, I kid you not, 13 girls screaming at me about rape culture. And the teacher just sat there and did nothing. And past that point, I got C's on everything. And then I had an essay that I wrote about the Scarlet Letter, and I talked about Christianity and Bible references and things that had to do with that. And I ended up getting a C on it because it wasn't appropriate for school.
Right. So you read a book that's steeped in Christian ideology. It's ironic to me. You think about a book like The Scarlet Letter. One of the reasons that book is picked in high schools is because it gives liberal professors a chance to attack Christian values, right? The Christian values of the Puritans. Here you are in that very class reading that very book, and your big sin is that you took the time to explain the Bible background of that book to your classmates. And for that, 13 girls started screaming at you and the teacher did nothing. I thought, Sarah, and this is going to be a terribly sarcastic question, I thought that public school, high school classes had to become safe spaces where there were no yelling, there was no bullying, there was no group beating down of other people's opinions. But I guess if you're a conservative, that kind of bullying is not just accepted, it's encouraged. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah. And the hypocrisy of all of this. I have long maintained that the biggest bullies on American high school campuses, it's not other kids, it's not the curriculum, it's not people stealing people's lunch money, it's these Orwellian cultural moves on the part of the left to shut down speech that disagrees, to shut down any kind of speech that has Christian or conservative overtones. And the fact that your teacher could basically suggest to you, right, that writing about the Bible in a book that's steeped in the lore and the language of the Bible is somehow inappropriate for public schools, but allowing girls to screech at you because of your attitude towards the largely inflated notion of rape culture in this country, that's allowed to stand unchallenged.
Correct.
And so you also mentioned to me, we talked before the show a little bit, you had a history professor that was pretty, and this doesn't surprise anybody in the least, but your history professor was a little bit, let's just say, ideological in his approach. Tell us that.
Well, it is actually a girl, and she has one of the biggest things that she continually brings up is the wall. Everything is about the wall. We are paying for, stuff in the Cold War, and it's way too much, like the wall. Or, like presidents are being overbearing, like Trump with the wall.
Right, and so how does she basically manages to work her contemporary political objections to Donald Trump's wall? She basically uses that as the template with which she views all former history. She's always able to bring that back in?
Right, yes.
Does she ever explain to you why she opposes the wall, other than the fact that it's over the top or extreme? Does she ever explain to you what her objections are with the wall?
Well, I actually ended up talking to her after class about it, and I asked her what she had against the wall, and her only response was it's too expensive.
Okay, so expenditure. This is interesting. I assume, as we've mentioned, your history teacher is a good progressive leftist, so it's too expensive. No argument about how Obamacare was too expensive. No argument how we spend more and more money on education every year for worse and worse results. We spend more money. We funnel more money into teachers' unions like the one she's a part of and get less and less in terms of actual results from our kids. Nothing from that?
No.
No, I didn't think so. Well, that's good. And so the last thing I want to talk to you about, and this is a really serious issue. This is one that, a lot of us, we have been calling attention to for a long time. I remember back 6 and 7 years ago when Common Core and the increased federal pressure to centralize education was coming down in spades. I remember looking at the National Sexuality Standards, this document that was produced about comprehensive sex ed reform, and I knew where this was going to go. We're no longer going to teach human sexuality for 2 weeks in a health class and devote it to biology, birds and bees. The idea of sexuality now is something that kids are going to be exposed to from kindergarten all the way through high school, and they're going to get it in every single class, almost every single subject. And it's not just, again, the mechanics of sex. It's the culture of sex. It's permissive sex. It's the idea that we're encouraging in younger and younger kids that sex is completely amoral. It's just fun. That as long as you are protected in some technologically way, there are no consequences. Talk a little bit about some of your experiences with an out-of-control sexualization in your curriculum.
Well, it wasn't terrible at my school. They did send home a note. It just so happened to mention nothing about sex ed or anything. It just said we were learning about reproductive health. And so my mother didn't actually think to tell me any of that stuff because she didn't know we were going to learn it. And then the first thing I heard was about sex was a detailed description from a substitute teacher in my science class.
And what grade was this?
This was sixth grade.
As early as sixth grade. So you had a substitute teacher in sixth grade science. Were you studying sexuality during that part of the semester? And so this substitute just picked up where your teacher had left off, or was this a complete non sequitur?
This was just, they decided we were doing sex ed.
Okay, on that day, the substitute just decided that's what she was going to talk to you about.
Right.
Okay, and how did that conversation go? What kind of things did the substitute teacher bring in? Were there materials, workbooks, or was this just a conversation you had with a substitute teacher?
Well, the biggest thing that I remember is up on the projector, there was an all-around animation of a naked woman and a naked man. And I remember it was girls and boys were separated, and I remember a lot of the girls were just completely floored by it.
So the substitute teacher segregated the girls and the boys in separate rooms. Is that what happened?
Yes.
And so when you got to see that video, a lot of your classmates were, when you say floored by it, were they upset? Were they embarrassed? Did they find it funny? How did they react to it?
Well, it seemed like a lot of them, also hadn't had this talk with their parents. So this was their first time ever even seeing anything that had to do with this.
And was there anything else? I mean, whether in sixth grade, I know you were a junior in high school now. As you're in high school, have you had more encounters with sexuality education in places that you wouldn't have expected to get it?
Not completely. One thing that I have been informed of, though, is in other places in Indiana where they are having Planned Parenthood representatives come in to teach sex ed, and they're having children act out in role plays different sexual acts and foreplay acts. Thankfully, I was never subjected to that, but it's scary that is happening and it's spreading.
Yeah, we have lots of evidence of Planned Parenthood having a disproportionate impact in the public schools. And parents are not notified. Planned Parenthood representatives from Planned Parenthood are invited in. And because they're not teachers, because they're invited in, they're given much more latitude than a teacher could get away with. And they can skirt around some of the consent issues. I know also there's some talk about legislation in Indiana that is trying to fix the problem by forcing schools to get consent from parents to opt into any of the sexuality talk. But in your situation, and what we're talking about with these Planned Parenthood people, is this was a substitute teacher, right, who there's really no consequence. The school can claim plausible deniability, right? That this substitute teacher did something that we wouldn't have had her do, although the teacher picked up right where she left off, right? It's as if somehow a substitute comes in, triggers this discussion. The teacher says, oh, okay, we weren't going to do that today, or we weren't going to do it at all, but all right, I'll take up from where she left off. Again, all without any consent from mom or dad. And so did you have any conversations with your own parents about what was going on in the school, and how did that go?
Well, when I first got home that first day with the substitute teacher, I came home crying and ended up having to have that discussion with my mother. And she was mad because she didn't completely realize that this was going to happen. And as I've gone through the years, we've had more and more things not necessarily related to that have just come up that were so biased. Like in 8th grade, we used to start out class every day for 10 minutes where we would go onto this website where there was a game that you would play, and each day there was a different game on how you could stop global warming.
And what was the subject of this class?
This was a science class.
So, all right. So the first 10 minutes of science class, not spent understanding geological time periods or grappling with the intricacies of the universe. You're spending 10 minutes a day for weeks on a time playing how to fight global warming games, basically. Thank you for being such a role model and willing to speak to us today. I hope your story and your courage inspires other kids. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us today.